My name is Luk Van Langenhove. I now work at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel in Belgium, and I was trained as a psychologist, and since then had a kind of hybrid career, both in academia and as a civil servant. I was Deputy Secretary General of the Ministry of Science Policy for a couple of years, and then I moved to the United Nations as Director of one of the United Nations University Research Centers. And now I'm back at the university as leader of EUTOPIA project at VUB and as a person that is dealing with science diplomacy. Well, actually there is a kind of long past to be told about science diplomacy, but there is only a short history. The long past is that there has always been a relationship between scientific developments, technological developments and international relations, especially then of course war, because war needs weapons and weapons need technological advancements. But gradually we see that science became also important not only for military purpose but also for economic purposes. And the idea to compete with states, with other powers, was more and more driven by scientific progress as such. And this resulted then in the idea that science is a factor that is very crucial to the development of prosperity of individual states. But on the other hand, we also saw that scientific results and scientific research became important to understand the global challenges. And it is in that context that the notion of science diplomacy first emerged. There is a lot of talk in many states around the world about implementing the tools for doing science diplomacy, and that is of course geared towards diplomats. It's diplomats that have to do the work. But it's also related to the definition that is still in progress at this moment. And basically you could say that science diplomacy is consisting out of three dimensions. The first dimension is mobilizing scientific results and scientific research for diplomatic purposes or for foreign affairs purposes. That's one. Two is the reverse. It's the mobilizing of diplomatic endeavors for creating supranational collaborations in, like for instance, research infrastructures as CERN and others. And then thirdly, and that's the most important one I think, it's the idea that even if states are in conflictuous relations with each other, that you can still have them work together on scientific problems, and that the scientists working together can pave the way for better relations and better communications between conflicting states. Of course, how to do that in practice is not always easy, because also there is a tension between the efforts of science diplomacy of states on the one hand, and the idea to use scientific collaborations or stop scientific collaborations as a way of sanctions. And case by case, this has to be seen what is the best way to move forward by, let's say, by focusing on the dialogue on the one hand, or by using the lack of scientific collaboration as a kind of sanction. There is always a tension between science being an open endeavor, being as open as possible in publishing your results and making data available, versus the idea that you want to be technologically sovereign, and that you want to say some results we do not want to share with each other. And that tension plays on a day-to-day basis, I think, for most advanced states in the world. But of course the idea is, first of all, I think we should stress that there is nothing wrong with using scientific results for your own personal state interest in this case, or for economic interest. But of course, on the other hand, we should also be aware that a lot of scientific research can serve and should serve the global commons or the public commons, and not the individual states themselves. At this very moment, most of the universities are not really engaged with science diplomacy, unfortunately. Unfortunately, because of several reasons. The first reason is that science diplomacy as a practice still lacks sound, let's say, scientific theories that investigated, that give the basis of why science diplomacy is important. So we need much more research on science diplomacy itself, and that should be done, I think, by the universities. Secondly, because quite a lot of scientists, of course, are based at universities, we have to be sure that the scientists can deliver on science diplomacy. And for that, they need to be aware of their own role in the whole process, one, and they need to be trained in certain capacities to deliver. And that again is something where I think the university should play a role in the future, and where, by the way, projects such as EUTOPIA could be of help by creating the environment of organizing on a transdisciplinary, trans-international or international dimension, the trainings and the awareness. Of course, most of the thinking on that, in that part, was aimed at trying to find good rationales for instance, the existence of CERN, the existence of the European Southern Observatory in Chile, the European Space Agency and things like that. But you could also extend it to the whole idea of creating alliances of European universities. And of course, in principle, we don't have the results of that yet, but in principle, yes, it makes sense to think that you can increase the, let's say, the cosmopolitan feeling of students that are engaged in universities that are part of one or another alliance. At my knowledge at this moment, there is not much happening to create spaces of dialogue between, let's say, Russian scientists, Ukrainian scientists, or for that matter, European scientists. On the contrary, the dominant thinking seems to be going towards sanctions and isolate as much as possible the Russian scientists. Now, there are different ways to look at it. One perspective that I always want to stress is that whatever conflicts we have going on in the world, we also have some common major problems, some challenges. Climate change, for one, is the most important at this moment. And I think that somehow we should find ways to continue the joint research on climate change related matters, whatever conflicts there are, whatever issues there are with human rights or something like that. This is a kind of very high stake goal that we should tackle with humanity as a whole. And there I'm on a personal basis, I'm a defender of keeping up dialogue and keeping up the engagement also with Russian scientists for that matter. That is at least what the defenders of science diplomacy and the advocates of the science diplomacy hope. But to my knowledge, we still lack convincing demonstrated cases that show us that this has happened because we've been doing this and doing that. So again, what we need is, I think, more assessments, more research on the whole topic of science diplomacy to really focus upon what makes it in certain cases that it works, what makes that it doesn't work in other cases. I mentioned that in the common definition of science diplomacy, there are three dimensions, and the science in diplomacy, diplomacy in science, and science for diplomacy. I think there is a fourth dimension that is becoming more and more important. That is the scientists that should use diplomatic methods themselves to get their message across and to defend themselves to those who are thinking that it's all conspiracies and stuff like that. So absolutely, we need much more, I think, an active role of the scientists in defending the business of science and in defending scientific results. It should be organized at all levels. First of all, you need especially awareness at the individual level. The individual scientist should be aware of what can happen with her results, on how to present them to the bigger audience. And then it should be, of course, taken over by the higher organizational levels, the groups, the departments, the universities, and indeed the alliance. And at the end of the day, it's the big scientific organizations like the International Science Council that should also be engaged in defending the business of science. What we've seen is that the European Commission has launched a couple of projects, actually 3 projects on science diplomacy. I was director of one of those 3 projects. But what we noticed is that the capacity to engage in studies of science diplomacy within European universities is still limited. We don't have departments or research groups on science diplomacy. Some people are affiliated to, let's say, science society studies, others to more managerial aspects of science. So there is still a need to further develop that. But there is hope that it's going to change soon, because the Commission is now working on preparing an agenda for science diplomacy, and that should be the beginning or the start of a whole strategic project on science diplomacy. That there will be, as in many cases, a balance between what is happening at the member states, at the level of the member states, and what the European Commission can do on top of that, or in order to support what's happening at the member states. But it's clear that science diplomacy is something that should be organized at all levels of policy, meaning the regional policies, the national policies of member states, and then the European policy. I think the universities in general have a really important role to play in the development of science diplomacy, basically by organizing research and theory formation about the whole process on the one hand, and on the other hand to make sure that the researchers that are based at several universities, that they understand what science diplomacy is and that they are ready to engage with it. So there is both an issue of capacity building and of theory development that can be done by universities. I think the Utopia Alliance is particularly well fitted to play a role in that, because we have opted for this idea that we go for a kind of horizontal connection of all the different research topics and educational topics that we are pursuing. One of the big advantages of the Utopia scheme is that we are organized not on specific thematic issues, but that we want to really bring together the whole of the universities. And in that sense, I think science diplomacy should be an issue of concern and also of things that we want to offer to our students, to our researchers, to give them the skills to be able to be good diplomats of their scientific business. My view on this is that it's especially at the level of PhD trainings that we already should bring in the concept of science diplomacy, so that from an early term in the career, the scientists know about science diplomacy and about the need to engage with also public debate and the idea that they have to sell, between brackets, their own research. I already mentioned that the Commission has funded 3 projects on science diplomacy. I'm forgetting always the acronyms, but it's the LSIT one, it's the EU for Science Diplomacy. Anyway, forget about the acronyms. What happened after the projects were finished, the 3 directors came together and decided on an informal, voluntary basis to start an alliance. And so we have constituted the EU Science Diplomacy Alliance with all the partners that have been involved in the 3 projects, and we are open now to new partners that want to join us. And we are hoping to become a kind of a spokespartner to the European Commission for the further development of science diplomacy. And indeed, at this moment, the Commission has decided to set up a steering group with representatives of the member states, representatives of the European institutions on the one hand, and academia. And I'm one of the members of that steering group to prepare the text for the agenda that is going to be put before the Council. Utopia is involved in the Alliance in several ways. Some of the Utopia universities are already a partner of the Alliance as such. Others have just filed their request. And what I hope is, of course, that the whole of Utopia will become a member of the Science Diplomacy Alliance as such. Besides, we have in the Utopia More project that is starting now, we have foreseen a work package on awareness and capacity building into science diplomacy. So yes, there are quite some links between Utopia and the science diplomacy activities launched by the European Commission.